Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today's founder is Richard Cary, an aide-de-camp of General Washington who took Martha Washington on a little bit of a ride. And before we get started, I just want to note, Richard Cary is very obscure. There are arguably 32 aides-de-camp to General Washington, although it's arguably because a few more people served in that role, though not officially, but Richard Cary is one of the 32 aides-de-camp that Washington had during the Revolutionary War, and he's one of the very few who doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. I know Wikipedia is not the best place to research things, but you would think an aide-de-camp of George Washington would probably have a Wikipedia page. So, I did some digging and found out what I could about Richard Cary through many of his letters. So, Richard Cary was from a pretty wealthy Massachusetts family. As such, he was able to attend Harvard. After he graduated, he helped his family with their wealth because they were a merchant family, and he ends up traveling through most of, if not all of the 13 colonies, trying to expand his parents' business. And it's during this trip that he meets George Washington for the first time. Now, time elapses, and he goes back to his home in Massachusetts, and it's about that time that the American Revolutionary War breaks out. George Washington comes to Massachusetts. Richard Cary joins the fight pretty much right away, and he serves as a lower-level officer throughout the Siege of Boston. And in June of 1776, about 2 months after the British evacuate Boston, and about 2 months before they come for New York, Richard Cary is promoted by General Washington to become an aide-de-camp. And in this position, as you may be familiar, the aides-de-camp had, well, a whole bunch of responsibilities, including basically waking up early in the morning and writing letters all day long on George Washington's behalf, trying to get supplies, trying to get support, trying to organize troops, trying to move troops, just literally everything that running an army does. Washington would do primarily through his aides-de-camp. Richard Cary was one of these people. He would only hold this position for about 7 months, from June 76 through independence, through the British invasion of New York City, until the following December, where he leaves ostensibly to get married. Though we'll talk about his later life in just a moment. It's between the Siege of Boston and the New York campaign that something very interesting happens. As you see next to me, Richard Cary actually teams up with Robert Hanson Harrison, who was one of George Washington's most important and most underrated aides-de-camp. And the two of them take Martha Washington on a ride. You see, Martha Washington had come out to Massachusetts to visit with George. And Richard Cary, with Robert Hanson Harrison, their duty is to escort Mrs. Washington from Washington, D.C. to New York. Interestingly, they take a different route than the Continental Army. They take a more interior route. This ostensibly seems to be just to make sure that no one, if there was a surprise attack on the Continental Army, Martha Washington would not be involved. It is a bit curious that it was just a handful of people escorting her through New England, leaving her kind of more exposed than you might expect, but either way, they make it to New York successfully. Good job, Richard Cary. When he gets to New York, Richard Cary serves in the field. One of the things that aides-de-camp would do during battles is they would take messages from the commander-in-chief to the commanding generals around the field. So they would go out there dodging bullets on horseback, going from Washington to a general and coming back, giving Washington's instructions. Now, New York doesn't go so well for the Patriots, but Cary sticks with the army, as I said, until the following. He resigns about November and leaves in December of 1776. Again, because it's time to get married. I want to double back real quick. I forgot to mention, the reason he got this position is actually family friend John Adams, who he knew personally, recommended Richard Cary to the Continental Congress, which is how word got to Washington, and since they were both in Boston, it just went swimmingly. So, Washington, as I said, Cary serves for several months, serves for about a year and a half in the war, and about 7 months in Washington's family, as it was called. Cary then continues to help the Patriots because he wants to also extend his family's merchant firm. And he goes down to the Caribbean, St. Croix to be exact. It might be pronounced St. Croix. But he goes to the Caribbean and opens a merchant trade. And what he does is he essentially runs the gauntlet. He takes, he joins the very dangerous yet lucrative trade of smuggling goods from the Caribbean to the American colonies through the British blockade, which, again, the British had one of the best, if not the best, navies in the world at the time. Cary was very successful at this. He doesn't get caught, and he gets, not only does he hurt the British by getting goods into the Americans, but he's actually getting goods to American citizens. It's not like other people who were smuggling in arms and ammunition for the cause. He was bringing in everyday items that Americans needed. It's one of the reasons it was so lucrative, is he didn't have to take the crappy continental dollars. He was able to take regular people's money, so to speak. And he did this, and he, as I said, made a lot of money, but he also was able to support regular people who were affected adversely throughout these trying times. Cary eventually ends up moving to upstate New York, and this is a time of rampant land speculation, and many American founders fell victim to poor investments about this time. Now, Cary actually buys a little bit of property and sets up a mill, because at the time, after the Revolutionary War, well, people were flocking out to the frontier to build little villages and towns, and every village and town would essentially be built around mills, sawmills to build houses, and grist mills to grind flour, which could be sold on the market or used to feed yourself. Now, unfortunately, it seems that Cary was not really up to this task. It was both expensive and laborious process to run these mills, and eventually, not long after he gets there, he's forced to declare bankruptcy. Sadly for Richard Cary, he spends the next several years of his life living rather modestly, trying to get by, and eventually, unfortunately, like everyone we talked about on this channel 200 years ago, he does pass away, and he's actually buried in Cooperstown, where he lived just about a stone's throw from where the National Baseball Hall of Fame now sits. So that's the story of Richard Cary, an extraordinarily obscure aide-de-camp to General Washington himself. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit like. If you're new here, definitely subscribe. I put out videos about the American Revolution 7 days a week. And if you want to check out some of the new merch I just put on my website, go to the link in the description below, because there's a lot of fun stuff there I think you might like. I'm Jason, and I will be back with another Founder for you tomorrow.